So thank you for being here. Appreciate that, especially on such a beautiful day. I'm going to talk about Barefoot Dreams of Petra Luna, what inspired it, and because it's based from family stories. So a lot of the family stories I had came from my great grandmother and my grandmother, who's here on the left. And their stories were passed down to my mom, who's here on the right. And that's me when I was about 3-4 years old. And ever since I was that age, I'd always loved listening to stories. And a lot of the stories were about how they grew in their childhood. So this is the typical home that they had growing up, my grandmother and great grandmother. So it was a hut. It was made out of adobe blocks. And those adobe blocks were stacked up to make a long room, similar to this one here. And look at the roof. It's made out of thatch. And there's 2 doors, no windows. And can y'all see those images okay? Yeah, okay. And a lot of the research I found in the pictures is that a lot of the kids, there's a lot of siblings that would take care of the younger ones. So that's something I found out from history, from the family stories, and also from the historical research I did. And just like my great grandmother, she lost her mom at 9 because of childbirth. And after that, she had to take care of her younger brothers and sisters. So it's something that was common back then. And things we take for granted now. When women have babies now, they go to the hospital to have kids. And back then, they had them in huts like this. So if there are any complications, there was no doctors or technology there to help. So a lot of women passed away during childbirth. And other stories I heard was about the work they did as children. So for instance, my grandmother, she got her first job when she was 4 years old. So if you can imagine a 4-year-old working, having a job already. And it was a local rancher who hired her, who had about 40, 50 goats who she was in charge of. So she had to make them, protect them. So in the morning, she would take them out of the corral, take them to the creek to drink water, take them to the pasture to eat grass, and then back to the corral. She did this 3 times a day. Didn't matter the temperature, the weather. That was her job. And she talked about one time being about 5 years old when this ice storm was approaching really fast. And she had to gather the goats quickly and put them in the safety of the corral. Well, she's struggling to get these goats together because a lot of them don't want to move. They're stiff already because the temperatures are dropping pretty fast. And this one big goat in particular, she's pushing him and he's standing right by the creek. And so you imagine this 5-year-old pushing this big goat. And she slips and falls into the creek and she manages to get out, but she's soaking wet. She's drenched. And she gets these goats together. And in her mind, she's only 5, but in her mind, she knows that if one of the goats dies or, gets lost, she gets fired. And if she gets fired, they're not going to pay her and she won't have the money to help her family buy food. So she manages to get the goats together, puts them in the corral. And at that moment, she said, by the time she's locking the gate, she can't feel her fingers anymore. They're numb. But she manages to lock that gate. And after she does that, she collapses just because she is so cold and exhausted. And they told her later on it would take another 3-4 hours before they found her. And by the time they found her, she was blue, and they almost lost her that time just because of the temperatures, the elements that she was exposed to. And when she was 12, she would climb trees and chop wood and strap it to her back, like this girl here on the left picture. And she said those were good days when there was work to be done, because it was bad when they would go from house to house or ranch to ranch asking for work. And when they would say, sorry, but we're not hiring right now, then that's when the real problems began, because they had nothing to eat. And, they would have to resort to the grasses or the weeds on the side to eat those to stay alive. So if you think about this, you think about kids having to work, they don't have the luxury to go to school. And the only ones who could attend school are the ones that are well off that, don't have to work. So think about Mexico back in 1913. You want to take a guess of what percentage of people could read and write back then? Any numbers? Show of hands.
What do you think, Grace? How many people do you think could read and write in Mexico?
What percentage?
Maybe like 10%.
10% is the guess?
All right. So it's 20%. Yeah. So 20% of people could read or write. So that means 80% cannot read or write. So that's a huge number right there. So if you think about it, when you have that many people, 80% that cannot read or write, that's going to cause problems in a society when you have that many people that are not educated. So keep that in mind as we go and through this presentation. So I showed you the outside of the hut. This is what the inside of the hut looked like. And they had no furniture, no beds, couches, chairs, tables. Everything was done on the floor. They cooked on the floor. They slept on the floor. And the floor wasn't a nice carpeted floor, tile floor. It was the earthen floor. It was dirt floor. But this is how they lived. So y'all want to see how the rich people lived back then? So this is how the rich live. So it's a extreme comparison, right? I mean, when you think about it, consider how different the homes look. So these houses here are the mansions of the haciendas. So the haciendas were these land estates that were just thousands and thousands of acres. And the hacienda was owned by one family. They owned all that land. And some haciendas were really large, like the Terrazas family in northern Mexico. Their hacienda is said to have been the size of Connecticut and Rhode Island put together. So you think about it, it's just millions of acres, millions and millions of acres to one family. They own all that. And you see this patio of the hacienda in the background, you see the fields. So in those fields, they would grow crops. And of course, it wasn't the hacendados who grew the crops, it was the peasants. They hired peasants to work the fields. So the peasants would work the fields, the crops would be harvested and sold, and the money went to the hacienda, to the hacendados. But the peasants would get paid. They would get paid once a month. And when they got paid, the peasants had to go to the store, to buy goods for their family, food, medicine, clothes, whatever they needed. And the only store accessible to them was the hacienda store, because remember, they're huge estates. So they have their own store, they have their own church. And if they wanted to go to another store, it would have to be another hacienda, which is really, really far away. They don't have the luxury of time to travel there. So they had to go to the hacienda store. So if they went to the hacienda store and wanted to buy goods for their family, the goods were expensive. They didn't have enough money. So a lot of times the hacienda store would say, you know what, don't worry, take what you need, but we're going to add your name to this book and we're going to put how much you owe us. Next month, when you get paid, you pay us what you owe us from this month, and then we'll be free and clear. So the peasant would take away the stuff, go back to work, and the next month when he got paid, he went back to that store because he needed more goods for his family. And again, he couldn't afford those goods because they were expensive, much less pay off the debt that he owed. But again, the hacienda store would say, well, take what you need, but we're going to add to this debt now, because you haven't paid out. So that debt would grow more and more every month. And the peasant couldn't say, you know what, I quit. I don't want to work here. I'm leaving. I don't like it here. If they owed money, they were not allowed to leave. They had to pay off that debt. So some people worked all their lives in the haciendas. They'd be teenagers and go into adulthood, and they'd be, old people owing a lot of money. And if they died, who do you think that debt went to once they died? So if you said their children, you're right, because it would go to their children, So imagine yourself, you're working really, really hard to pay off your debt. You're almost there. And then suddenly your uncle dies or your grandfather dies, and now you owe their debt. So it was just a way for the hacienda to keep people there, not leaving. And some people would say, you know what, I'm going to run away. I'm fed up with this. I'm leaving. Well, you see these guys with the tall sombreros in the patio. Those are called rurales. And the rurales were the mounted police that the hacienda would hire. And if a peasant ran away, the rurales would go chase after them, capture them, bring them back, punish them, and then put them back to work. So that was just the life of the peasant in the hacienda. So other stories I heard from my family was about the prejudice between the rich and the poor. So there was a lot of prejudice there. When I saw this photograph, it really inspired me. It really, it captured everything that I'd heard in stories. So you see these four women wearing really nice silk dresses, and you see a woman and child walking opposite direction. They're dressed the way my family would have been dressed, with the ragged clothes, the shawls, the bare feet. And you see this woman here that's grabbing at her skirt. She's tucking it in, and she's giving them a glance. So what do you think is going through her mind as she's doing that, as she's tucking at her skirt? You want to say, what do you think she thinks?
What do you think?
I think we-
I don't know. They're probably rich.
Yeah. He's
Probably
rich.
didn't want to get dirty, huh?
Yeah. It's like, ew.
Yeah, that's what I get from a lot of young readers. They say, yeah, it's like disgust, like this look of disgust, like don't touch me, and she's looking at her, like glaring at her. So when I saw this photograph, I was so moved by it that if you read Barefoot Dreams of Petra Luna on the second chapter, you'll recognize this. And that's because, like I said, I was so motivated that I said, you know what, I'm going to put my character in that picture because this encapsulates all that emotion that I heard in stories. And bare feet, I saw bare feet, in pictures and in my stories, my family stories. So everyone from my great grandmother to all the way to my mom, even, they were always barefoot. And that's because shoes are a luxury. Even now we're wearing shoes and we don't realize that a lot of people around the world can't afford shoes. And it was the same back then. Parents could barely afford to feed their kids, much less buying shoes every year because they grow so fast, sometimes twice a year. But it was the same. And my grandmother and great grandmother were part of that 80% that couldn't read or write. And at the age of 9, my grandmother realized, even at that young age, that she was never going to go to school. So, because she had to work. So she told herself, okay, I promise I will learn how to read and write one way or another. I'll figure it out. So every time she met someone that knew how to read or write, she would ask them, what does this word say? What does that word say? And little by little, she started breaking down letters and sounds. And by the time she was 12, she figured out how to read and write on her own. So to me, to see that determination in a 9-year-old is just incredible. And despite, she had a lot of courage too, because despite the way society treated her, they humiliated her or the way they glanced at her and stuff like that, she still walked tall. She was very proud of who she was. She knew, she was a hard worker and she had, principles and stuff like that. And she didn't let those humiliations bring her down or make her feel less than. She always walked tall and proud. And that's something that was instilled in me a lot too from her. So you think about the haciendas, you think about how powerful the haciendas are, that only 20% of people could read or write. So now think of Mexico in 1913 again. What percentage do you think owned land back then? Because the haciendas are really, really big. So y'all want to take a guess?
Yeah.
Maybe like 15%.
15%. All right. So let's look at the number. So it's 1%.
Oh my gosh.
Wow.
Only one.
Yeah, it's only 1% of people owned land back then. So that means 99%, almost all of Mexico couldn't afford land. It was just so expensive. So you ask yourself, what is happening? And what's happening is that the Mexican government, first of all, the haciendas are making a lot of money, right? Because they sell the crops. But some haciendas have silver in their land. They have copper, gold. So they make even way, a lot of money than just crops. So a lot of their money, they give it to the Mexican government. So the Mexican government grows really rich and powerful, and they want to give something back to the hacienda. So what they do is they give them more land. But where's this land coming from, right? Who are they taking it away from? So they're taking it away from the poor. And it was easy for them to take it away from the poor because remember, they don't know how to read or write. So any document they ask them to sign, they sign not knowing that they're giving up their lands. And also back then, if you didn't know how to sign your name, at the bottom line, you would just write an X or a cross because you didn't know how to write. So anybody could forge that X or cross, and lands were being taken away very easily. And so people would be living in their little plot of land, farming it, just comfortable in their small little land. And rurales would show up and say, this is it. It's not your home anymore. Get out. And people would say, well, why? They say it's not yours. And the only option they had was to either leave, or if they're going to stay there, now they had to work for the hacienda. Now they're part of the hacienda and they were required to work for them if they wanted to stay there. So it came to a point where people were fed up. They said, we're tired of this. Lands are being taken away. Our kids are not going to school. They have no opportunities. We want a better future for ourselves. So when you have a society that's oppressed, that much, you're going to have a revolution. You're going to start fighting against the oppressor. And that's what happened in Mexico. People started fighting the government. And the way I explain this war, because it's very complicated. I always tell kids, think of Star Wars. I always tell them, how you have the evil empire in Star Wars? Well, here you have the Mexican government that's in control of everything. But instead of stormtroopers that are fighting for the evil empire, you have the federales. The federales are the soldiers of the Mexican government. And on the other side, you have the rebels, and those are the revolucionarios, who they're the ones who want their lands back, opportunities for the kids. They want better living conditions. But you can say this war was all evil, or this side was all evil or all good. It's very complicated because a lot of federales didn't want to be in the federales. So like any war, it's very complicated. But what's neat about this war is that if your father or your husband, your son went to war, you followed him. entire families would follow them. So they would travel on top of the trains because inside the trains were the horses and supplies, officers. So everybody else traveled on top of the trains. So women had to learn how to cook on top of the trains, even when the train was moving, because they were going to eat, soldiers had to eat at the next stop, so they would cook. They'd be cooking tortillas, cooking everything, taking care of the kids and the babies. And I read stories of some women even, giving birth to babies atop of moving train because that's when the baby came. So these were very rough conditions, and people went through that just to be, with their loved ones during these wars. And a lot of it because women didn't want to be by themselves in the villages. And what was neat about this war too is that if you were 12 years or older, didn't matter if you were a boy or girl, you could join the rebels as long as you were 12. And once you joined, you were treated as a soldier. You were no longer treated as a kid. You were now a soldier. You were trained as a soldier. You were paid as a soldier. And a lot of the kids were trained as spies. And they were trained as spies because it was easy for them to blend in when they went to the other side. They could blend in, they're kids. They're playing with the other kids and nobody would, pay any attention to them, but they'd be listening to everything that the grownups were saying. And as soon as enough information was gathered, they go back to the rebels and tell them what they heard. And a lot of battles were won like that because of kids. And for the first time in military history, women were achieving really high ranks. Women were becoming captains, generals. There were some women general that had 500 troops under the command. And this was unheard of back before this in history, in military history. But my great-grandmother was only 9. She was not 12, so she couldn't be a rebel. And she had to run away because remember, she didn't have a mom. So she's taking care of her little brothers and sisters. And her dad, the Federales wanted her dad. They wanted all the men. They wanted to conscript the men. So Federales would come to a village. They would take all the men. They would attack it, take all the men. And if they didn't want to join, they would execute them. And not only men, they would also take boys. If you were 8 years or older, they would take you into the Federales. So these were 8-year-old boys. So they didn't care, that they were just boys. They would raid orphanages and just take the 8-year-old boys and above to join them. So as soon as people knew Federales were coming, they would flee. And that's what happened to my great-grandmother. She fled the desert. So I always tell young readers, imagine they're attacking your neighborhood, they're attacking your house, they're burning everything around, and you only have 30 seconds to grab something that's very valuable to you because you might never come back again. That's it, and if you come back, it might be all destroyed. What would you grab in those 30 seconds that you had? Do you want to give your thoughts? I had a kid say Xbox one time.
It'd be hard to plug it in somewhere.
That's what I said. He said, well, no, I'll keep it in case we run out of food. I can sell the Xbox and get money.
Well, yeah, that's a clever way to spin it.
Yeah. How about you? What would
I
you
always think photographs, but you almost need something useful.
Right. So look at this
Yeah, phone and wallet.
phone. Yeah. So look at this lady. Look at what she grabbed. You see this photograph here? So on the right, she grabbed a dog. So this is the part of the 4th or 5th picture I saw with somebody carrying their pets. They just couldn't leave without their pets, and they knew they were going to be walking across the desert, but that was so precious to them. They couldn't leave their pets behind. And my great-grandmother says she walked so this is Mexico here. This is the state of Coahuila. And this here is the border to Texas right here. So Texas is over here on the upper side, on the top side of the slide of the photograph. So my great-grandmother walked through the desert with her family, and she almost died in that desert because, it's just extreme conditions. But her goal was to reach a town called Piedras Negras, which is a border to Eagle Pass, Texas. And because mind you, it's not only my great-grandmother, but a lot of people from a lot of villages because the Federales are after them. And the Federales had threatened them with death. They said, if you run away, we will catch you. And once we catch you, we will execute you because you evaded us. So people were really, running away from them, seeking refuge in the United States. And the reason they're seeking refuge is because they know that if the Federales cross the border into the United States, then the United States would see that as an invasion because it's an army. And if it saw that as an invasion, they would declare war against Mexico. And Mexico didn't want a war with the United States. They're having one and they're having a revolution. They don't want a war with the US. So they knew. So that's why people knew that the Federales would not cross. So everybody's goal was to cross that river. So my great grandmother says she reached the town of Eagle or Piedras Negras. And this is the way the bridge looks now. This is the way it looked back then. And she said her and her father, her siblings, started walking across the bridge. And halfway, they had to stop because 2 gates were there and they were closed, they were locked. They wouldn't let them through. And on the other side of the locked gates were U.S. Army soldiers, and they were holding weapons, not letting anybody through. So at that point, they turned back and they went back to Piedras Negras, and they figured they still have 6-7 days before the Federales get there. That's what everybody's saying. So they figured, okay, we'll wait. Next day, they go back to the bridge. And again, it's closed. It's locked. Those soldiers are still holding their weapons, not letting anybody through. So they walk back to Piedras Negras. They sleep on the sidewalks. It's raining. It's cold. There's no food. And mind you, everybody's trying to run away from the Federales. So it's getting really crowded there in Piedras Negras. And people are starving and people are antsy. They're anxious because the Federales would come, in 5 more days or 4. So on the 3rd day, they walk again across a bridge, and they have to stop halfway again because those gates are closed and those soldiers are still holding weapons. So my great grandmother's father said, you know what, let's just wait here near the entrance of the bridge. In case they do open it, we're the first ones through. So they do that. They sit near the entrance of the bridge, and they're thinking they still have 2 or 3 days before the Federales get there. They're growing nervous, but they figure they have time. And as they're sitting there, people start screaming and yelling that the Federales are there. People say, Federales are here. So people grab their kids, they grab their pets, and they run for the bridge. And remember, my great grandmother was here, so she runs for the bridge too, holding her siblings. And so she was near the entrance. She started running, and she said she hit a wall of people because the bridge is flooded with people. And as soon as she hits it, she could see those gates, and they're still locked. And people are starting to shove and push and scream. They're pleading for their lives. And the American soldiers, the ones that were holding their weapons, they're running around. They're scrambling. Their faces are red. And my great grandmother says she could tell that they wanted to open the gates, but they had orders not to. So they're really frustrated. And people are really screaming. They're pushing. She's trying to gather her siblings so that they don't get lost in the crowd. When suddenly people start yelling even louder, really screaming. So she turns to see what they're screaming at. And when she looks over the hills, it's the Federales, in the Mexican side. They're coming down. They're on horseback, and they're not stopping. They're charging toward them. So at that point, she's holding her siblings. She's hugging them. And she said she thought, I'm 9 years old, and this is it. I'm going to die here on this bridge with my siblings. I'm going to get slaughtered here because the Federales are coming, and I'm trapped. They're not opening those gates. So this is my last day on earth. And at that moment, she said she turned to the American side. Saw American soldiers running toward the gate. They're waving their arms, shouting things in English. And one of them quickly starts unlocking that gate, and they swing open both gates there. And she said at that moment, she picked up her siblings and just dashed. She just ran as fast as she could across those open gates. And when she reached the American soil, she said she felt this overwhelming joy that she was alive. And she felt so grateful that she wanted to put her siblings down and go hug every American soldier because they had saved her life. And she always, every time she told that story, even my mom and my grandmother, at the end of the story, they always expressed just the gratitude they had for the United States for giving them the refuge. So this is a story I thought it was really powerful. And at one point I said, you know what, I'm going to write it for a magazine article because I was already writing for Highlights magazine. So I say, okay, but before I write this story, is it true? Did it really happen? So I went to the library and I checked out books on the Mexican Revolution, about 40 books, English and Spanish. And I had my questions, right? I answered most of them from what I told you, but I didn't know the when. My great grandmother had already passed, and my grandma and my mom didn't know even the year. So I said, no, baby, I'm sure I'll find it in these books. And I read all of them. It took me about 1.5 years. And there was nothing about that story, not a sentence, not a paragraph, nothing. So it was frustrating, because after 1.5 years, almost 2 years, you start getting tired and you wonder, okay, did this really happen? Was it stretched? My grandmother or great grandmother was only 9. Maybe she imagined the whole thing or saw 2 Federales walking by and was spooked. So I was about to give up. But guess what? A librarian saved the day. So that's what my shout out to the librarians. A librarian said, do not quit. Have you seen this? Do you know about this website? And I said, no, I've never heard of this. So it turns out this is an archive of newspapers that for Texas, each state has their own, but Texas has this one, and you have access to newspapers that were published even in the 1800s. So I said, that's great, but when do I start reading newspapers? So I went back to my books and came out with this date here, because this is the start of the Mexican Revolution, November 20th, 1910. So I said, my great-grandmother crossed the bridge after that date. So I began reading these newspapers, day after day, but it was like sitting in front of the TV. I was watching, I was reading what people were wearing, what they were eating, parades. I was learning about a lot of things. And after 7 months of reading papers, I found this headline. And this headline was this whole article was the story I told you. Exactly. That's what my great-grandmother had told, and it was there in that article. The only thing my great-grandmother was off about is that she said it was hundreds of people around her. It was actually thousands. It was 7,000 people that crossed a bridge that day. And now I had a date. I had October 5th, 1913. So in my detective work, when you have more information, you find more stuff. So it turns out somebody had a camera that day, and somebody snapped a photograph. So you see the municipal building in the background, that's Mexico. And this is the old bridge that I showed you earlier. And all these people are running for their lives. So somewhere in that crowd, my great-grandmother's running for her life. And even the American soldiers that she described, their uniform, there's one standing right here that I could see. And who knows, it might be this little girl holding her sibling. That might be my great-grandma. I mean, I like to think it's her, but, just to know that this is a family story that's been told for generations after generation, and to finally find an image is just mesmerizing. So the story continues. I have a second book called The Other Side of the River that follows Petra Luna, the character, to the refugee camp and then on to San Antonio. And I grew up in San Antonio, so I'm biased. I love the city. But I did San Antonio because 30,000 refugees ended up in San Antonio. So 30,000, that's a lot of refugees. And San Antonio only had 100,000 people. So that was a big change. That's a 30% spike in population. And there was limited resources, limited housing. So I covered that in the book, the struggles that the refugees had when they arrived. But this is my family story. So now I need you to find your family story, because they're like puzzle pieces, that complete you. You find out who you are, why you see the world, you see it. And it's all because of your ancestors. You carry a lot of that with you. So the more you learn about those stories, the more you learn about yourself. And about my great-grandmother crossing that bridge. And now we need to know about your family. What did they do? Because that impacts all of us. And it's something we grow about and learn. And also, history repeats itself. So the pictures on the left are from the Mexican Revolution. The ones on the right are recent pictures. So these two photographs are 100 years apart, over 100 years, but it's the same thing happening again. So both of these photographs, you see people in Mexico, they're walking up railroad tracks. You see the exhaustion in their faces. They're escaping homeland violence. They're heading north for a safer place. But you see that despair, so it happens again. That border that my great-grandmother crossed, this is the exact same border now. And there's still crisis there. So it's happening again. It repeats itself. The refugee camps, we have them now. We had them back then when my great-grandmother was there. And what's interesting is right now we have COVID. Back then they had smallpox, and people were really scared of smallpox. So when those 7,000 people crossed into Eagle Pass residents were really upset and said, no, send them back, because we're going to have an outbreak. The whole town's going to get sick and we're going to die. Send them back now. And the U.S. Army said, no, if we send them back, we're sending them to their death because the Federalists are there. They're going to kill them. So how about we keep them, in a parade field? We quarantine the ones that are sick, vaccinate everybody, and we'll keep everything under control. So luckily for my great-grandmother, they weren't sent back. Otherwise, it would have been a different history, and for her and her descendants. So, but you see how things happen again. They repeat themselves. Those disparities from the picture I showed you earlier between the rich and the poor, you see that gap widening more and more every day, not only around the world, but here in the United States, where you have ultra rich people and very, very impoverished people. But people come together to help each other. So this pictures in San Antonio on the left, you see women gathering food for the refugees. You see that all over the country too, where people are helping refugees. And you see that in Europe as well with Ukrainian refugees too. So it happens again. And these are stories we got to learn. So when you see, this is a picture I came across my research, and I just thought she was a beautiful lady. There's so much wisdom and light in her eyes. So whenever you meet people like this in your community, whether it's neighbors or family members, get the stories, always ask them what it was like when they were younger, their struggles or joys, because, those stories are not shared, and these people pass away. Those stories are gone. They're gone forever, and we could never get them back. And there's so much wisdom, and information and strength that is lost forever. So get those stories. And also your stories, for the young readers, your story about COVID, your story about adversities, share those, write them down, because you might have a grandkid that's going to write a book about you one day. So you never know. And I do have a website that shows different resources. If you're wondering if something's fact or fiction, I have that in there. I have a playlist that shows different musics that from the Mexican Revolution that I mentioned in the book. I have that a lot in here. And I'm going to share with you a couple of trailers so you can see the book trailer. I don't know if you can see. Oh, here's one of them. I'll show you this one, then I'll go to the next one. See if y'all could hear it. If you don't hear the sound, give me a thumbs down.
Okay.
My name is Petra Luna. I traveled across the desert in Mexico with my grandmother, sister, and baby brother, looking for a new life on the other side of the river. We lived in a refugee camp on the Mexican border and moved to San Antonio with a dream. Though the journey is difficult, and it tests my courage and strength like never before, I must continue to fight for myself, for my family, for my dreams.
All right. Well, thank you so much. So appreciate it. Let me